Don't drink that. There's a ghost in your glass, and a bag of death at your feet.
The neon pulse of the gilded cellar was a heartbeat Celine felt in her marrow, a rhythmic thrumming of bass and artificial ultraviolet light. To the wealthy patrons, she was just a ghost in a black and white uniform, a mobile fixture designed to keep the crystal glasses full and the tables clean. Celine preferred it that way. In this city, being invisible was a survival skill, one she had perfected over years of navigating spaces where she didn't belong. Her shift had started like any other, the air thick with the scent of expensive cigars and even more expensive desperation. She moved through the VIP lounge with practiced grace, her silver tray balanced on the tips of her fingers. She wasn't just serving, she was cataloging. She noticed the way the politician's hands shook when he reached for his gin, and the way the socialite's smile didn't reach her eyes. She saw everything, yet she said nothing. That was when she saw him. Taimu Han sat in the center of the madness, yet he seemed to exist in a vacuum of chilling silence. He was a study in controlled power, his sharp, clean-cut features highlighted by the purple strobe light. He held a glass of amber whiskey, his thumb tracing the rim with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. Around him, the air felt heavier, more dangerous. He was a man used to being the hunter, never the prey. Celine adjusted her tray, her eyes sweeping the booth as she approached to clear a discarded bottle from the edge. A well-dressed man, one of Taimu's own associates, stood up to make room for a guest. It was a fluid, unremarkable movement, but Celine's hypervigilance caught the glitch in the choreography. As the man smoothed his jacket, his hand dipped low, a flick of the wrist so subtle it would have been missed by anyone else. A small, clear bag hit the plush leather of the couch, sliding into the crevice just inches from Taimu's thigh. Celine's breath hitched. The bag was sealed, containing a fine, crystalline powder, but it was the sticker on the plastic that made her blood turn to ice. A red triangle, a biohazard symbol. She looked up. The associate was already turning away, his face a mask of practiced indifference. No one else had seen it. The guards were focused on the entrance. The guests were lost in the music. Only Celine knew that the most feared man in Seoul was sitting on a death sentence. Taimu raised his glass, the whiskey catching the light as it tilted toward his lips. Celine didn't think. She didn't weigh the risks of crossing the invisible line between servant and master. She stepped forward, the tray trembling slightly in her hand, and prepared to shatter the silence. The heartbeat of the club seemed to stall, the heavy bass morphing into a dull, distant thud in Celine's ears. Every instinct she possessed, the ones that had kept her safe in the shadows of society, screamed at her to keep walking. A girl like her didn't interrupt a man like Taimu Han. You didn't break the invisible barrier of the VIP velvet rope unless you were prepared to be crushed by the weight of what lived behind it. But the red symbol on the bag was a flare in the dark, and the whiskey was inches from his mouth. Celine shifted her weight, her formal black and white uniform feeling like a straitjacket. She could see the micro-movements of his jaw, the casual confidence of a king who believed his castle was secure. Behind him, the associate who had dropped the bag was already retreating into the crowd, a shadow merging with other shadows. If she stayed silent, Taimu would be dead within minutes, and the chaos that followed would swallow her whole anyway. She took the step. The air in the booth was colder, smelling of expensive sandalwood and the sharp, metallic tang of danger. Taimu didn't turn his head, but his eyes shifted toward her in a predatory slide, tracking her movement without moving a muscle. He was used to being served, used to the silent dance of the staff, but her trajectory was wrong. She wasn't placing a drink. She was invading his gravity. Celine leaned down, her silver tray acting as a shield between her and the prying eyes of the room. She felt the heat radiating from his white dress shirt, the raw power of a man who moved mountains with a whisper. As the glass touched his lower lip, she pressed her mouth close to the shell of his ear, her bun nearly brushing his temple. "Don't drink that," she hissed, the words sharp and low, vibrating against his skin. Taimu froze. The glass stopped, the amber liquid swirling precariously near the rim. He didn't pull away. Instead, he went rigid, his muscles tensing like coiled steel beneath his shirt. His pulse was visible in the hollow of his throat, steady and terrifying. "Unless you want to die in front of everyone," she breathed, her voice trembling with a cocktail of terror and defiance. "There's a ghost in your glass and a bag of death at your feet." She pulled back just enough to meet his gaze. For a second, the world vanished. His intense, observant eyes searched hers, calculating the probability of a lie versus the impossibility of her bravery. He didn't look at the drink. He looked at her, his jaw tightening as the first seeds of a lethal doubt began to take root. Taemoo Han did not flinch, nor did he pull his head away from Celine's proximity. He simply lowered the glass with a slow, deliberate gravity that felt more threatening than a sudden outburst. The base of the crystal tumbler met the marble tabletop with a sharp, echoing clack that cut through the surrounding bass like a gunshot. His eyes, dark and predatory, remained locked on Celine's for a heartbeat longer, searching for the flicker of a prank or the tremor of a trap. Finding only raw, terrified honesty in her gaze, he shifted his focus downward. His hand, large and calloused, reached into the deep crevice of the luxury leather sofa. The movements were casual, almost bored, but the air around the booth had curdled into a suffocating tension. When his fingers emerged, they held the small, clear plastic pouch. The red biohazard symbol, a stark, jagged geometry of warning, flared under the violet strobe lights. Inside, the crystalline powder caught the neon glow, looking less like a drug and more like ground bone. The silence that followed was a physical weight. The guests in the immediate vicinity, those who had been laughing and drinking seconds ago, froze as the realization rippled outward. Mouths hung open in silent gasps. Eyes widened in the universal language of shock. A man in a tailored suit at the neighboring table stood so abruptly his chair screeched against the floor, his face draining of color as he stared at the bag in the boss's hand. "A gift," Taemoo murmured, his voice a low, melodic rasp that carried beneath the music. He didn't look at the bag. He looked at the space where his associate had stood moments before. The betrayal was no longer a theory. It was a tangible, chemical reality resting in his palm. The VIP section erupted. It wasn't a scream, but a frantic, low-frequency wave of panicked whispers that moved through the crowd like a virus. Was he going to? The high society masks began to crumble, replaced by the primal urge to flee. Taemoo's personal security detail moved with lethal synchronization, their hands diving into their jackets as they formed a human wall around the booth, their eyes scanning the panicking elite for the next threat. In the center of the storm, Taemoo remained seated, the biohazard bag clutched between his thumb and forefinger. He turned the glass of whiskey slightly, watching a stray crystal of the toxin that had managed to cling to the rim. Then, he looked up at Celine. She was still standing there, her silver tray clutched to her chest like a shield, her breath coming in ragged hitches. To everyone else, she was a waitress caught in a crossfire. To Taemoo, she was the only variable he hadn't accounted for, and the only reason he was still breathing. The shift in the room was instantaneous and absolute, the air turning from panicked static into a cold, suffocating vacuum. As the VIP section descended into a muffled frenzy of retreating guests, a wall of dark wool and muscle materialized around the booth. Taemoo's guards moved with the silent, predatory efficiency of a pack closing in on a kill. Celine felt the heavy presence of men behind her, the unmistakable metallic click of safeties being disengaged, and the sudden, sharp pressure of a gun barrel pressing against the small of her back. She stood frozen, her silver tray now a useless piece of tin, her heart thundering so loudly she feared it would shatter her ribs. To the security detail, she wasn't the savior. She was the closest person to the boss, a nameless waitress who had breached his perimeter at the exact moment a biological threat appeared. Taemoo Han didn't tell them to stand down. He sat perfectly still, the biohazard pouch still held between his fingers, his eyes never leaving Celine's face. He was dissecting her. He looked at the way her pulse hammered in the hollow of her throat and the way her fingers trembled against the tray. He was weighing her life against the probability of a sophisticated double-cross. In his world, the most innocent face often masked the sharpest blade. "Search her," Temu commanded. His voice was a low, melodic rasp that offered no warmth, only a chilling, clinical curiosity. One of the guards stepped forward, his hands rough and efficient as he patted down the pockets of her apron and checked the hem of her skirt. Celine squeezed her eyes shut, hot tears prickling her lashes. She had spent her whole life trying to be invisible, trying to avoid the gaze of men like this. And now she was under the most lethal lens in the city. The guard pulled her small, battered wallet and a pack of gum from her pocket, tossing them onto the marble table next to the poisoned whiskey. "Clean, boss," the guard muttered, stepping back, but keeping his weapon trained on her chest. Temu leaned forward, entering her space again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a trial. He picked up her name tag, his thumb grazing the plastic where Celine was engraved in simple print. The silence stretched, agonizingly slow, as he searched for a crack in her terror. He was looking for the smirk of a martyr or the calculated coldness of an operative. All he found was a woman who looked like she was waiting for the world to end. "You knew exactly what was in that bag," Temu said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate level. "A waitress doesn't just recognize a high-grade toxin by accident, Celine. So tell me, did you save me because you're on my side, or because your employers wanted to ensure I stayed alive long enough to suffer?" The accusation hung in the air, heavier than the gun barrel, still biting into Celine's spine. Temu's gaze was a physical weight, stripping away her layers until he reached the raw, frantic core of her survival instinct. He didn't wait for her to defend her innocence. In his world, innocence was a fairy tale, and utility was the only currency that mattered. "I don't care why you know what that symbol means," Temu said, his voice dropping to a silk-wrapped blade. He stood up, the movement slow and terrifyingly fluid, forcing the circle of guards to expand to accommodate his stature. He didn't look at the chaos of the fleeing club. He looked only at her. "I care about the hand that dropped it. My men are trained to see threats from the front, Celine. But you were looking at the shadows." He reached out, his fingers cold as they wrapped around her forearm. It wasn't a violent grip, but it was absolute. He pulled her closer, forcing her to stand at the edge of the velvet-draped booth, turning her toward the line of his most trusted associates who had remained in the VIP wing, the men who were supposedly his shield. "Look at them," he commanded, his breath ghosting over her ear, a dark echo of her own earlier warning. "The room is locked down. No one leaves until I find the rot. If you're the savior you claim to be, point to the hand that touched this couch. If you lie, or if you hesitate, you become the culprit by default." Celine's vision blurred for a second as the strobe lights caught the sweat on her brow. Her eyes swept over the line of men. They were all statues of stone and expensive silk, faces masks of frozen loyalty. But then she saw him. Standing directly behind Temu's right shoulder was the man with the styled hair and the sharp suit she had noticed earlier. He was the picture of stoic defense, his hand resting near his holster, yet his eyes were fixed on a point just past Celine's head, anywhere but at the biohazard bag on the table. A cold shiver that had nothing to do with the air conditioning raced down her spine. The man was Temu's shadow, the one person entrusted with the boss's literal back. Her hand trembled as she raised it, her finger feeling like lead as she pointed. The silver tray she still clutched in her other arm rattled against her side. "Him," she whispered, her voice cracking but certain. "The one on the right. He didn't just drop it. He tucked it in like he was hiding a secret." The silence that followed was the sound of a fuse burning out. Temu didn't turn around immediately. He felt the shift in the air, the sudden, jagged spike of adrenaline from the man standing inches behind him. The hunt was over, and the execution was about to begin. The air in the VIP lounge turned brittle, a frozen tableau of impending violence. Temu didn't move, but the man behind him, the Lieutenant Celine had identified, saw the world narrowing down to a single, lethal point. He didn't wait for the boss to turn his head. With a snarl of desperation, the traitor reached into his blazer, but instead of drawing a weapon, his thumb slammed onto a small, black remote concealed in his palm. A deafening, synthesized crackle tore through the sound system, followed by a total, suffocating darkness. The neon pulse of the gilded cellar vanished, as if the club had been plunged into the bottom of the ocean. The strobe lights, the violet glows, and the digital displays all died at once, leaving only the smell of ozone and the sound of 1,000 panicked hearts. In the absolute pitch, the screams of the remaining guests became a disorienting wall of noise, and the sound of heavy furniture being overturned echoed like thunder. Celine felt the cold grip on her arm tighten. Temu's hand was a vice, anchored in the void. "Don't move," he commanded, his voice a low vibration she felt more than heard. But the chaos was moving toward them. She heard the scuffle of leather soles on the marble. The traitor was fleeing, using the void as his shroud. The guards were shouting, their flashlights flickering on and dying as the electromagnetic pulse from the traitor's device fried the electronics in the room. "He's heading for the service lift," Celine whispered, her voice surprisingly steady despite the terror. "He'll be trapped. The secondary security gates drop when the power fails." "And the main exits?" Temu asked, his breath hot against her ear as he pulled her closer, shielding her body with his own as a bottle shattered nearby. "Lined with facial recognition scanners that are now locked shut," she explained, her mind mapping the skeletal structure of the building. Celine had spent hundreds of hours navigating these hallways in the dim light of late-night cleaning shifts. She knew the texture of the wallpaper, the exact number of steps to the kitchen, and the narrow service tunnels that bypassed the security deadlocks. "In the dark, this club is a labyrinth, Mr. Hahn, and your men are looking for doors that no longer open." A gunshot rang out, a sharp, stinging bark that silenced the screams for a heartbeat. The traitor was firing blindly, trying to clear a path. Temu's grip shifted from her forearm to her hand, his palm rough and commanding. "The exit, Celine," he muttered, the steel in his voice returning. "You are my eyes now. Let me out of this grave, and I'll make sure you are the last thing the traitor ever sees." Celine took a breath, closing her eyes to better visualize the path. She didn't need the light. She knew the floorboards that creaked and the pipes that hissed. With the most dangerous man and soul anchored to her, she stepped into the blackness, no longer a waitress, but a navigator in a kingdom of shadows. The darkness was absolute, but to Celine, the club had begun to breathe in a language of tactile cues. She moved with a silent, rhythmic certainty, her hand acting as a tether for the heavy, radiating heat of Temu Han. Behind them, the VIP lounge was a symphony of chaos. Heavy boots thundering against marble and the frantic, metallic sliding of semi-automatic bolts. "Left," she whispered, her voice barely a ripple in the air. 3 steps, then a sharp drop. Temu stumbled slightly, a sharp intake of breath escaping his teeth. The scent of sandalwood was now underscored by the heavy, iron tang of fresh blood. The blind shot in the dark had found a home in his shoulder. Celine felt the weight of him increase, his large frame leaning more heavily into her small stature, yet his grip on her hand remained an iron shackle. He was a wounded predator, suspicious of every shadow, yet forced to trust the one woman who lived within them. They slipped through a heavy, industrial swinging door that smelled of industrial degreaser and old steam. This was the kitchen, a cavernous, stainless steel labyrinth that mirrored the luxury above with cold, utilitarian efficiency. Celine guided him past the jagged edges of prep tables and the hulking silhouettes of walk-in freezers. Why this way? Temu's voice was a low, jagged rasp, vibrating with a lethal blend of pain and distrust. The main service elevators are death traps. Celine breathed, her eyes fixed on a small, rectangular hatch near the floor, illuminated only by the faint, ghostly glow of a backup battery light. But the laundry chutes lead directly to the subterranean loading docks. They don't exist on the guest maps. She reached the hatch and pulled. The heavy steel groaned, a sound that felt like a scream in the silence of the blackout. From a hallway they had just vacated, a flashlight beam cut through the dark, sweeping across the kitchen walls like a searching eye. The hit squad was close. In, she urged, stepping back to give him room. Temu looked at the narrow, dark void of the chute, then back at Celine. For a second, his intense eyes searched hers, weighing the possibility that she was leading him into a furnace or a trap. But as the shouting of the traitor's men grew louder, he saw the fierce, focused courage in her gaze. He wasn't looking at a waitress anymore. He was looking at a partner in a war he was currently losing. He slid into the chute, his movements grunted and pained, and Celine followed immediately after, as the steel door clicked shut, plunging them into a vertical slide of cold metal and darkness. She felt the sudden, terrifying rush of gravity. They were descending into the bowels of the city, leaving the velvet and neon behind for the grit of the underground. The descent ended in a bone-jarring thud onto a pile of damp, discarded linens in the subterranean belly of the club. The air here was thick with the scent of bleach and stale exhaust, a stark contrast to the sandalwood and whiskey of the world above. Temu groaned, his hand clutching his shoulder as he rolled off the pile, his white shirt now a canvas of crimson. The backup generators groaned to life, flickering the overhead fluorescence into a sickly, rhythmic strobe that mimicked the dance floor's pulse, but with none of the glamour. From the level above, the muffled sounds of the blackout shifted into the sharp, rhythmic staccato of automatic gunfire. The hit squad had engaged the remnants of Temu's loyalists in the main lounge. Every explosion of sound echoed down the vents, a violent reminder that the luxury they had fled was being torn apart by lead and betrayal. "The loading dock is 50 yards that way," Celine whispered, pointing toward a heavy steel door marked with a glowing red exit sign. "The keypad is manual. Once you're through, the alley leads to the subway entrance. You can disappear." Temu leaned against a concrete pillar, his face pale, but his eyes burning with a cold, unrelenting fire. He looked at the door, then back at the service stairs where the sound of heavy boots was rapidly approaching. The traitor's men were coming down. He fumbled for his weapon, his movements slowed by the spreading numbness in his arm. He was the king of an empire, but in this gray concrete box, he was just a target. Celine looked at the exit. Freedom was right there. A few dozen steps, and she could return to being a ghost, a name tag in a drawer, a woman who had never seen a biohazard bag or felt the weight of a mafia boss's hand. Her heart screamed at her to run, to let the shadows reclaim her before the blood hit the floor. But then she looked at Temu. He wasn't reaching for her to pull her back. He was bracing himself to stand alone, his jaw set in a grim mask of finality. He had expected her to run. He expected everyone to run eventually. The service door at the top of the stairs kicked open with a metallic crash. Celine didn't head for the exit. Instead, she lunged for a heavy industrial laundry cart, her sneakers gripping the slick concrete as she shoved the metal frame in front of Temu's position to create a makeshift barricade. She grabbed a heavy wrench from a nearby maintenance bench, her knuckles white as she stood her ground beside the man who had called her his eyes. "You're still here," Temu rasped, his voice a mix of disbelief and something that sounded dangerously like respect. "I'm the only one who knows the way out," she said, her voice trembling but hard as steel. "And I'm not finished working yet." The transition from the industrial grime of the club to the sterile, fortified silence of the safe house was a blur of adrenaline and cold rain. The safe house was a glass and steel monolith perched high above the city, a sanctuary that felt more like a cage of high-end security. Inside, the air was filtered and still, smelling of antiseptic rather than the sandalwood Temu usually carried. Celine stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, her waitress uniform torn and stained with the boss's blood. She didn't look at the glittering skyline. She looked at the reflection of the room behind her. She watched the way the two remaining loyalist guards shifted their weight, noticing the slight delay in the one on the left. He was favoring his leg, likely injured in the stairwell. She saw the way the medical technician's hands trembled as he finished stitching Temu's shoulder. "You're doing it again." Temu's voice drifted across the room, low and gravelly, cutting through the hum of the air conditioning. He was sitting on a minimalist leather chair, his torso wrapped in white gauze that contrasted sharply with his tanned skin. He wasn't looking at his bandages. He was watching her. "Doing what?" Celine asked, her voice sounding thin in the expansive room. "Scanning," he said, gesturing with his good hand toward the guards. "You've already mapped the exits. You've noted the weaknesses of my men. You saw the poison before I did, and you saw the traitor when my own security was blind. That isn't just luck, Celine. It's a burden. Most people see the world as a picture. You see it as a series of threats." He stood up, ignoring the technician's protest, and walked toward her. He stopped just inches away, reclaiming the space he had occupied in the club's VIP booth. But the predator's edge in his eyes had been replaced by a clinical, intense respect. "I spent millions on sensors and trained soldiers, yet a waitress with a silver tray was the only thing that kept me breathing," he murmured. "Your hypervigilance isn't a flaw, Celine. In my world, it's a weapon. It's the only thing more valuable than a bullet." He leaned closer, his shadow falling over her. "So here's the choice. I can have a car take you home. I will wipe your records, pay your debts, and you can go back to being invisible. You can go back to the tray, and we will never speak again." He paused, his dark eyes locking onto hers, searching for the fire he had seen in the laundry chute. "Or, you stay. You become the eyes I clearly don't have. You join my inner circle, and you never have to be invisible again. But know this. If you choose the circle, the shadows you see will become very, very real." The city lights flickered in the glass between them. Celine looked at her reflection, then at the man who had turned her life into a war zone. The tray was safe. The circle was certain death. Yet, for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like running. The velvet rope didn't just part for Celine this time. It fell away like a conquered barrier. The scent of the gilded cellar was the same. Expensive tobacco, ozone, and artificial jasmine, but the air felt different against her skin. She was no longer wearing the black and white polyester of the invisible. She wore a silk gown the color of midnight, tailored to move like a shadow. Her hair, once pinned back in a functional bun, now cascaded with a refined elegance that framed her sharp, unblinking eyes. Beside her, Temu Han walked with the silent, rhythmic gait of a king restored to his throne. His arm was no longer in a sling, though the way he held his shoulders suggested the memory of the lead was still fresh. He didn't lead her into the VIP section. He walked with her, his hand resting lightly, but possessively on the small of her back. The club had been scrubbed of the previous week's blood and biohazard, the neon purple lights now casting long, dramatic shadows across a crowd that had grown suddenly, terrifyingly quiet. They reached the central booth, the same leather couch where a death sentence had almost been carried out. Temu sat, but he didn't reach for a drink. He waited. Celine stood at his right shoulder, the very position once occupied by the traitor. She didn't look at the menus or the stage. Her gaze swept the room with the clinical precision of a high-velocity scanner. She watched the hands of the bartenders, the nervous twitch of a promoter's fingers, and the way a regular patron's eyes darted toward the service entrance. To the room, she was the boss's new obsession, a trophy of his survival. To Temu, she was a living radar. "The man in the charcoal suit at table 4, Celine said, her voice a low, melodic chime that reached only Temu's ear. "His ring is turned inward. He's gripping his glass too tightly for someone who's supposed to be celebrating." Temu gave a slight, imperceptible nod. Two shadows in the wings of the club began to move toward table 4. And the girl by the pillar, she continued, her eyes never pausing. She isn't checking her phone. She's checking the reflection of the security cameras in the screen. She's looking for the blind spots. Temu leaned back, a cold, satisfied smile touching his lips. He finally picked up a glass, fresh, poured by a hand Celine had personally vetted. He didn't need to look at the room anymore. He had found a weapon that was sharper than any blade in his armory. You were right, Celine, he murmured, looking up at her as the music began to swell. Most people see a picture. You see the cracks. Celine didn't smile. She simply adjusted her stance, her eyes locking onto a new set of hands at the edge of the light. She had traded her tray for a kingdom of secrets, and she wasn't going to miss a single heartbeat. The waitress was gone. The tiger's eyes were open.